You're taking clients to dinner, then form...
The media often makes a habit of pinning labels on people. Hillary Clinton's label is controversial. Why is that? Most Americans have barely heard her speak for more than a brief soundbite. But over the weekend, Jane visited Hillary Clinton for an exclusive Dateline interview.
Well, Stone, tonight we hope to get to know Hillary Clinton a little bit better and find out what kind of first lady she might be. Even though she's got high name recognition, it's true that people don't really know Hillary Clinton firsthand, but they've certainly heard what other people say about her.
Elect me, and you get 2 for the price of 1, Mr. Clinton says of his lawyer spouse. And what does Hillary believe?
From the podium of last month's Republican National Convention came a spectacle rarely seen in American politics, a candidate's wife under attack. Among other things, they said she'd likened marriage to slavery. Who is the real Hillary Clinton? A native of Illinois, 18 years ago, she followed her fiancé to Arkansas and later became the state's first lady at the age of 31.
I, Bill Clinton,
do solemnly swear.
do solemnly swear.
Arkansas wasn't accustomed to a first lady with a law career or one that kept her own name, though she changed it to Clinton in 1982. But she won over the people with her involvement in charities and children's projects.
Well, I know the hospital certainly appreciates that. We tried not to...
But she was much more than a ribbon cutter. She chaired the commission that wrote the state's acclaimed educational reforms. A veteran of 2 decades of political campaigns, she barnstormed the country last spring. But she hadn't mastered the art of the soundbite, and her effort to explain why she'd kept her own job was taken as a slap against housewives.
I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was to fulfill my profession, which I entered before my husband was in public life.
A graduate of elite schools, Wellesley and Yale Law, she's considered a leading expert in children's issues.
How we treat our children should be front and center of that agenda, or I believe it won't matter what else is on it.
But because the Clintons have tried to keep their own child out of the spotlight, most Americans had never seen 12-year-old Chelsea until July's Democratic convention. And then last month at the GOP convention, there were those attacks on Hillary Clinton as anti-family.
Well, Hillary believes that 12-year-olds should have the right to sue their parents. Well, speak for yourself, Hillary.
Tonight she does. Last Friday, I talked with Hillary Clinton at the governor's mansion in Little Rock. If you become First Lady of the land, will you be the same kind of First Lady that you have been here in Arkansas? Or are you thinking of really redefining the position?
You know, I want to do what is right for me in terms of the contribution that I can make. And I really believe right now we need a comprehensive children and family agenda in this country. And the way I think about it is, what do I try to give my daughter? What I want to do is be a voice for children in the White House. And by that I mean I want to marshal the resources, I want to help create the constituencies and implement the kind of agenda that would really make it possible for us to say we are not neglecting our children as a nation, which right now we cannot with a straight face say.
How is that different than what any other First Lady has done? Because I get the impression that you quite seriously mean to be an unprecedented type of First Lady.
My approach is just a little different, I guess, because, you know, I've drafted legislation. I've testified about legislation. I understand how the pieces of a budget fit together, because it's not just an emotional hope on my part that we do better by our children. I feel so strongly that it is the smart, cost-effective, preventive investment that we need to make. So I can talk that language as well.
What is it about that? What is it about you that pushes people's hot buttons?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I think part of it is that I do have opinions, and I do state my opinions, and I have never, ever been sorry if somebody disagrees with me, as long as they fairly and accurately understand what it is I'm trying to say. But maybe the fact that I have such opinions, maybe the fact that I state them forcefully, is a little bit troubling to people.
Some of your wounds are self-inflicted.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And I think you actually used the words self-inflicted. What have been the worst mistakes you personally have made?
I think not understanding the process and therefore kind of stumbling into some situations that I didn't really appreciate. And of course the famous is the out of context tea and cookies remark. I mean, that was something that I learned a lesson from, that, you know, when you try to say something that is long and complicated and 30 seconds can be pulled out of the middle, you always have to be aware of that. And I learned that I want to be understood clearly. And that instance, I was misunderstood, and it was my own doing.
When you hear yourself held up as you were at the Republican convention, some people have used the word demonized. Does it make you hurt or make you mad?
You know, it was such a strange experience because I thought to myself, what are they talking about, number one? I mean, they were not saying anything truthful that I could tell about me. They were doing it for political purposes. I knew that some of the people knew better. I mean, Mrs. Bush wrote a book about literacy programs and included this program called Hippie that I had brought to Arkansas and was very complimentary about my role. And President Bush once wrote me a handwritten note, you know, thanking me for bringing infant mortality to his attention. I mean, they knew the kinds of things that I cared about and that I've stood for and worked for.
What was the worst thing you've heard said about you?
Oh, gosh. Oh, I don't know. I really try not to read it or pay attention to it. I really don't.
All right. What was the grossest distortion of your record?
Well, I think taking my, my written articles and plucking 2 sentences out of context and trying to make it seem that I advocated that children should be able to sue their parents if they were told to take the garbage out or something like that.
Give me, if you will, a specific circumstance in which a child should have the right to take his parents to court.
The kind of horrible examples of children chained to radiators, or the terrible example of the young girl who was, you know, Lisa Steinberg, who was killed in New York. Those kinds of horrific examples. There does need to be some way for that child needs to be heard, and that means the child has to be represented.
This isn't a case of suing because my parents won't let me wear contact lenses,
No. No.
you know, or get an after-school job.
Or have your ears pierced or any of that stuff. No.
How did slavery get in the same paragraph with marriage?
For many, many centuries, a woman was the property of her husband. It was a historical example.
It wasn't a comment on the institution itself?
On the institution in the past, perhaps, because anyone who knows anything about the history of marriage knows that wives and children were literally the property of husbands until about, the early 19th century when that began to change.
They are using your words, your own words, against you in a rather shrewd way.
Oh, in a rather dishonest way. I mean, it's just totally dishonest.
At the Republican convention, there seemed to be an attitude that Marilyn Quayle had the moral high ground because she gave up her law career to raise a family and be supportive for her husband. Will you cede her the moral high ground?
I think what we ought to do is quit drawing lines between women and say that, you know, it's wonderful that women have the opportunity to make all these choices now. And I have so many friends who have been, at different points in their lives, full-time homemakers, full-time career people, but most of us, and most women in America, are trying to balance home and work responsibilities. The last thing we need is more finger-pointing or blaming or line drawing.
Before Governor Clinton declared for the presidency, you prepared Chelsea. Bad things may be said about Daddy. Was Chelsea at all prepared for bad things being said about Mommy?
I think that what we've told her ever since she was a little girl is that in politics, sometimes people get desperate and they say things that aren't true. And, you know, I told her at one point, I said, well, you know, honey, they're going after your dad and they've gone after me. They may go after you. They may go after our cat. I mean, you know, you just have to be prepared for that. But you cannot take it personally.
How did it happen that even well into the spring, many Americans did not know that you had a child? They thought Hillary and Bill Clinton were a childless career couple.
Well, because we really have tried hard to keep her life out of politics. So we haven't dragged her around and showed her off and done a lot of the things that I think really interfere with a child's sense of herself. But I was surprised to hear that.
The Working Mother Guild, the Non-Working Mother Guild. We all have...
The Women Guild.
That's right. Do you have any thoughts on how to deal with it?
I think the only solution I've ever thought would work is trying not to be so hard on myself and not to be prey to that perfectionist tendency that, you know, sits on top of so many of our heads saying, well, you know, you've got to do everything absolutely perfectly, and to have some sense about what the important priorities really are.
What do you do not perfectly?
Oh.
You cook?
Oh, I could give you a long list, but I won't. Why would I disillusion you like that?
I don't cook so much. Do you cook?
Not so much, no.
Well...
I mean, what I make, I do okay, but it's a limited repertoire, at least these days.
You're a member of the baby boom generation, as I am. What about our generation makes you proud? And what about our generation makes you wish we'd grow up?
We came of age, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the women's movement, Watergate, an impeachment of a president. I mean, we've lived through, in our growing up years, as many psychic shocks to the body politic as you can imagine. And a lot of us have had to really kind of find our way, make sense of the world that we're in. So I think, from my perspective, where we are now, most of us in or approaching middle age, which is hard to say, most of us have come through pretty well.
Do you think that there is, in our generation, some reluctance to let one of us be the guy in charge?
Well, do you remember the first time you ever went to a doctor who was younger than you? I do. Yeah. I mean, it was a tough adjustment. I think that that's part of growing up and growing older. But I think it's time. I think we're on the right side of history. I think that the kinds of challenges that this country faces needs new leadership, needs the lessons that we've learned.
Can a First Lady be both popular and opinionated?
Well, it's interesting because the polls that have been done, I guess for probably the last 20 years, about the most admired First Lady put Eleanor Roosevelt at the top. And certainly, she was opinionated. And she did things for her time that were just extraordinary. It was because she herself saw needs in the country and knew that if she didn't play a role in expressing them, they might go unnoticed. So, yes, I think you can be popular, whatever that means, and have opinions. But from my perspective, given where our country is today and given the challenges that we face, maybe we need to do with a little less popularity and a little more courage.
So Hillary Clinton isn't out to win any popularity contest. And even though voters say that they don't make voting decisions based on a candidate's spouse, nonetheless, he or she can contribute to the candidate's aura, positively or negatively.
You know, Jane, back around the GOP convention, Barbara Bush was giving all those interviews and sounding so partisan, and there was concern in the Republican camp that she might debase her currency by being too partisan. And so she has gone back to being the old Barbara Bush, still very visible on the campaign trail, but not as partisan. Now, Hillary is, by her own admission, opinionated, and there is a conscious effort to keep her in smaller markets right now, but has she been toning herself down?
I think it inevitably, when you're going to get gun-shy, when you've had interviews and develop a perception that they're out to get you, you're going to measure your words a little more. But, you know, at the Republican convention, they did bring Hillary up so consistently. But, you know, with possibly a boomerang effect, Hillary Clinton has had unusually high negatives, but after the Republican convention, they fell 6 points. Maybe she ought to thank them.
Thanks, Jane. Well, coming up, NBC's Maria Shriver with the emotions brought on by a case of child snatch.
You're taking clients to dinner, then form...
The media often makes a habit of pinning labels on people. Hillary Clinton's label is controversial. Why is that? Most Americans have barely heard her speak for more than a brief soundbite. But over the weekend, Jane visited Hillary Clinton for an exclusive Dateline interview.
Well, Stone, tonight we hope to get to know Hillary Clinton a little bit better and find out what kind of First Lady she might be. Even though she's got high name recognition, it's true that people don't really know Hillary Clinton firsthand, but they've certainly heard what other people say about her.
Elect me and you get 2 for the price of 1, Mr. Clinton says of his lawyer spouse. And what does Hillary believe?
From the podium of last month's Republican National Convention came a spectacle rarely seen, and her effort to explain why she'd kept her own job was taken as a slap against housewives.
I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was to fulfill my profession, which I entered before my husband was in public life.
A graduate of elite schools, Wellesley and Yale Law, she's considered a leading expert in children's issues.
How we treat our children should be front and center of that agenda, or I believe...
Kept her own name, though she changed it to Clinton in 1982. But she won over the people with her involvement in charities and children's projects.
Well, I know the hospital certainly appreciates that.
We tried not to. But she was much more than a ribbon cutter. She chaired the commission that wrote the state's acclaimed educational reforms. A veteran of 2 decades of political campaigns, she barnstormed the country last spring. But she hadn't mastered the art of the sound in American politics. A candidate's wife under attack. Among other things, they said she'd likened marriage to slavery. Who is the real Hillary Clinton? A native of Illinois, 18 years ago, she followed her fiancé to Arkansas and later became the state's first lady at the age of 31.
I, Bill Clinton,
do solemnly swear.
do solemnly swear.
Arkansas wasn't accustomed to a first lady with a law career or one that